In the last few videos, we've talked a bunch about advanced DOM concepts, and in this video, I'm going to take all of those concepts and improve our simple list application into an advanced to-do list application. So I have a few tabs open so we can kind of see what we're working with. This over here is just the simple list application we created a while back. We can type something in here, add it, type something else, add it, and if we click any of them, it'll remove them. One problem with this though, is if we just add a few items, and refresh our page, it deletes everything we had, which is something we're going to improve upon. And also, we have no way to actually delete these items or complete them separately. I want to be able to mark an item as complete or delete it, so I want to have two operations that I can do while also saving everything. So let's just close out of this because this is what we had previously built. And over here is going to be what we're going to build. It looks very similar. We just have this, form here. It's a little bit differently formatted, but it still works the same. We can type in some to do here. We can add it to our list. And as you can see here, we can check it on and off. Same thing here. We can add another to do, add another to do. We can even delete an item if we want. And best of all, if we refresh our page, you'll notice all of these to do items stay on our page. So we're actually saving this locally inside of our browser. We're going to take care of all of this inside of this video. So let's just go over to this advanced to-do list tab. This is going to be exactly what you see on the left hand, just this index.html and this simple style sheet. And if you want to get these starting files, I'm going to have them linked down in the description below this video. So make sure you go check that out, download those files so you can start exactly where we are. Now, one thing you'll notice almost immediately is this looks very similar to our simple list application. We have a UL for our list items, and we have a form here for creating a new list item. And then the main difference here is we have this thing called a template, which contains all of the HTML for each one of our new list items. And a template tag inside of HTML, if you're unfamiliar with it, essentially allows you to write out HTML that does not get rendered to the page. Everything inside of here does not get rendered, but we can actually take this template tag inside of JavaScript and we can copy it so that we can use this HTML to create new elements from it. Instead of having to write all this out by hand in JavaScript, we can write it out in HTML and then clone this template, and it'll give us all of the HTML inside of here, inside of JavaScript to work with. I'll show you that in a little bit when we get to that point inside of the coding tutorial, but essentially that's all a template tag does. And in this video, I really want to explore the idea of how to think about getting started with a project, because this is a bit of a more involved project. There's a lot of stuff going on. We have saving, we have loading, we have creating to-dos, deleting to-dos, completing to-dos. There's a lot of different tasks that the user can do and that this program has to manage. So I want to go about how I'd actually go about planning these different tasks and thinking them through myself. So the very first thing I want to do is just get a JavaScript file loaded up, because obviously we need JavaScript to do all of this. So let's just create a script tag here. I want to make sure it's deferred, and I'm setting this source here to script.js, which we're just going to create now. So script.js. There we go. So now we have our script page being loaded up, and we can just say console.log hi. And if we inspect over here, we should hopefully see in our console hi being logged out. So of course this is working as we expect. Now, when I go about planning out a project, one of the first things that I like to do to figure out where to get started is figure out what the user can do to interact with. Because whatever the user can interact with on the page is clearly needing to be handled inside of JavaScript. So inside of our to-do list application, we need the ability to add a to-do. So let's just put that in a comment. We'll say add to-dos. We also need to give them the ability to delete to-dos that they've already added, as you saw previously. So we'll say delete to-dos. And we need to be able to mark a to-do as complete or incomplete. So we'll say complete to-dos. These are the three actions that our users can take on our page. And this is fairly easy to get to because all you really need to do is understand the problem that you're solving. So we know that these are the three things that our user can do. Now, the next thing that I like to do, if I want to think about the problem even further, is to think about the things that happen behind the scenes that the user may not actually be doing directly, but is caused by the users nonetheless. And that would be saving and loading our to-dos, because we need to be able to persist this data. So it's just another feature we need to have. So we can say save to-dos and load to-dos. These are kind of the five main features of our application. These top three are things that the user interacts with, which generally when I'm writing out JavaScript, I start with the user interactions because it's much easier to get started and start testing them, because immediately I can click add to do, for example, and if I had the add to do code, that would immediately start working. While saving and loading, it's really hard to start there because you don't actually have any to-dos added or deleted, so you really can't test it. But I like to start with the thing that is the easiest for me to get started with that doesn't rely on anything else, and adding to-dos is the perfect one for that. So now the next thing that I like to do, once I've decided what I'm going to work on, which in our case is adding a to-do, I want to figure out what are the steps involved with adding a to-do. The way you need to think about this is start from what the user is going to do, because this is a user action. So we know immediately the user is going to type in a to-do and click the add to-do button. So we can just say user will type in to-do and click add to-do button. Okay, this should then add the to-do to the list above. There we go, pretty straightforward. We just really want to think about what the user does and what they see. That is going to give us a good idea of what we need to do in our code to make these things work. Because as you can see, the user is going to type in a to-do, then they're going to click the add to-do button, and then they expect that to-do to appear in their list. So we obviously need to be able to check for when they click this button, and we need to be able to get the information inside of the to-do that they're typing out. So we need the information in this input and what happens when they click on this button. And that right there is a great starting point for what we need to do. This further later section we can talk about in a little bit, because right now we really want to focus on this because this is an easy place to get started with. So to do that, we need to first get a few items. If we go to our index.html, we can see our form here has a new to-do form ID on it. So we can just say const form equals document.query selector, and we'll do new to-do form, just like that. And you may be curious why I'm getting the form when we're checking to click the add to do button. And the reason for this is that if we just did an event listener on the clicking of the add to do button, it wouldn't really work 100% because what we're really doing is submitting a form with data inside of it. But the user doesn't really think about it that way. But you need to realize that when they click this button, what they're actually doing is submitting this form here. So that way we want to get the submit event on the form to handle this form submission as opposed to just listening for the click on this button. So it does require you to kind of translate what the user expects into code. That's why we're getting this form here. Now the next thing we need to do is get this to-do input, which has the ID to-do input. So we can say const to-do input equals document.query selector of to-do input. So now we have the input they type into as well as the form that they're submitting, and we can get started on this very first step here. Let me just bring this down into its own comment. So user will type in to-do and click add to-do button. So in order to handle this, we need to do an event listener on our form for submit. That's going to handle whenever they click on this button. And of course, the very first thing we want to do here is prevent the default, since we don't want to actually manually refresh our page when they submit this form. So now the next step, since we've already handled when they click the add to do button, we need to get what they type from the to do, and then we need to display that inside of the list that comes above. So we need to get a reference to the list. We'll just say const list is equal to document.query selector. And if we just go to our index.html, we can see this has an ID of list. So we can just get the element that has the ID of list, just like that. So now we have a reference to the list, and we can start creating a to-do inside of this form. So in here, we can just say const to-do name is going to be equal to to-do input.value. This just gives us whatever they type inside of this box here. That's going to be the name of our to-do. And now all we need to do is render that to-do in our list. So we can just create a function called render to-do. We're just going to pass in that name. And you may be thinking, like, what in the world is this render to-do function doing? It doesn't really matter. All we need to know is that this render to-do function is going to render the to-do for us. And we don't really want to worry about thinking about that right now because we're inside of this event listener right here. We really want to focus on all of the code inside of here, and then we can worry about what the render to do function looks like in a little bit. It's easier when you just kind of chunk your code, and when you get to something complex that's a little bit more difficult to understand, just throw it into a function and don't worry about it. Or if you don't want to put it in a function, just put a comment here that says render to do, because we know that's our next step. And we could just do that, for example, and say, okay, I know that I need to render out this to do. Right now, all we've done is got the to do name, and we need to render the to do. But once we get the to do rendered, we want to clear out the input inside of here, because when they click add to do, we want this input box to clear itself. So we can just say to do input.value equals empty string. That's going to clear this input. And now immediately, if we type something, click add to do, you'll see it clears the input for us. So that is all working as we expect. Now the next step is just to render out the to do. So we could say render to do and pass it in the name of the to do that we want to render. And let's just create that function. Say function render to do takes a to do name, and inside of here we just need to run all of the code for rendering and showing our to do. And like I mentioned, we're going to be using an HTML template for this, which just allows us to really easily handle bulky amounts of HTML without writing it all out by hand inside of JavaScript. So let me show you how to actually get the code from this template. First, we need to select it with this ID here. So we can just come up here, say template is equal to document.query selector. This is just an ID list item template. So now we have access to the template. Then what we can do inside of our render to do is we can get a clone of that. So we can say template clone is equal to template.content, content.clone. This is just a function. It's actually called clone node. And what this is going to do is it's going to get all the content inside of our template, which is all of this code here, all this li, label, input, span, all of that. And it's going to clone it into this template clone here. And if we want to make sure we get everything inside of this template, all we need to do is just pass true to this, and that's going to get all of the code, even if it's deeply nested inside of our template, and it's going to put all of it inside of this template clone here. And if we just console.log our template clone, we can see exactly what this looks like. Let me just save here, type something, click add to do, and if I inspect our page, you can see we get this thing called a document fragment. And when I open it up, you can see we have that li, which has the label, which has the button, and the input and the span. So it has all of the content that we expect exactly from our template here. And now we can actually populate the to-do name into this span right here, which is called data list item text. Because as you can see, we have a label, which has a checkbox. Then inside of there is a span, which contains the text for our actual to-do. So we can just select that on our template clone here. So we can just say const text element equals template clone dot query selector. We want a query selector on this data attribute right here. So now we're just getting this text element from this clone. So we're getting this span right here. And we can just say text element dot inner text is equal to to-do name. Now all we need to do is add this to our list. So we can just append the child to the end of our list and pass it in our text element. Let's see if this works. If we just come over here, type in something, click add to do, you'll notice this gets added to our to-do list right here. Of course, it doesn't quite look right because we don't have the checkbox or the delete button, so clearly something in our code is incorrect. And when you run into a bug in your code, it's really important to go to whatever you most recently changed. Because you'll notice there's no errors in the console, so clearly we just typed something into our code wrong. So this render to do function is the thing that is not working because this is the most recent thing we changed. And if I just go in here, I say, okay, we have our template clone, that looks correct. We're getting our text element with the correct ID. We can even reference to make sure that this is the correct selector, which data list item text. We have here data list item text. That's correct. Go down to the next step. We're setting the text equal to our to-do name. That's correct, as we can even see by the output over here. But finally, this one, list.append child, we're appending the text element instead of the entire template clone. So we just need to change this to append our entire clone. And now if we add a new to-do, you'll notice it has the proper checkbox. We can check it and uncheck it. And over here, it has the delete button. But clearly this delete does nothing. And when we refresh, clearly none of this is being saved. You'll also notice another slight bug. If we don't enter any text inside of here, we click add to do, it'll add an empty to do, which is clearly not something that we want. So something that I like to do after I write out my code for a certain section, for example, we have all of the code here for adding a new to do and rendering it out. I like to think about edge cases. And edge cases are essentially anything that's going to happen in your code that is uncommon. For example, it's very uncommon that someone would click add to do when they don't have anything entered, but it could happen. And you could get left with a bunch of blank to-dos like this, which is clearly not what you want. So what we need to do is write out some code that's going to check for that edge case and handle it properly. So for our case, we just want to check to see if this input value is empty. So what we can do is just say if to-do name is equal to an empty string, then we know that we don't want to actually render the to-do or set the value here. So we can just return out of this function. What this is going to do is exit prematurely, which means that we're never going to get to this rendering and we're never going to reset the value to a blank string. Now, if we click add to do, it doesn't matter how many times we click it, it's never going to add a new to do. And to make sure this is working without errors, we can go to the console and make sure there's no errors in there, just so we know that it's actually doing our code as opposed to just failing, and that's why it's not adding. So now we have this failsafe in place to check for that edge case. And just to make sure everything else still works, let's add a to do with some text, and you'll see that works properly. So now the next logical thing to work on is going to be saving our to-dos, so when we refresh our page, they're still day. So let's get rid of some of these comments of stuff that we've already completed for adding the to-dos. We're going to move on to this section for saving to-dos. So we're just going to come up here, save to-dos. That's what we're going to be working on. In order to save the to-dos, let's just create a function to do that. So we'll say function save to-dos. And inside of here, we need to actually write the code for saving out our to-dos. And right now, we really don't have a good way to reference all of our to-dos because they're all stored in our HTML. We want them to be stored in our JavaScript as well. So we're going to create a variable called to-dos. We're just going to set it equal to an empty array because we're going to have an array of different to-dos. And when we create a new to-do, for example, down here, we're just going to add that to our array. So we can say to-dos.push, and we want to push in our to-do name. Now, every time we add a to-do, we're going to be adding it to this list here, this array, and then we're going to be rendering it out. And then all we need to do is just make sure we call save to-dos. And we can just reference this global to-dos variable. So now that it's time to actually save our to-dos, we're adding the to-dos to the array right here. So we have an array of all of our different to-dos. We need to think about what the best method is to save these. And like I said, local storage is the default that you're going to use unless you have a reason not to. So we need to think about what reasons would we want to use cookies or session storage. Cookies would be great if we need to send this information to our server, but we don't have a server, and we wouldn't even need to send this to our server if we did, so cookies definitely don't make sense. Next would be session storage. Do we want to delete this information when we close our tab? No, that doesn't make sense. We want this information to be here even if we close our browser and come back tomorrow. We want these to-dos to be around as long as possible. So obviously local storage makes the most sense. So what we can do is just say local storage.setItem, and in here we need to give it a key. And a big hint that I'm going to give you is when you're working with local storage, session storage, or anything that requires this key, I highly recommend creating just a global variable called key prefix, or you could call it local storage prefix. We'll say local storage prefix, and you're going to set it equal to something that relates to your application. So we'll just say advanced to-do list, and we're just going to put a hyphen at the end here. And this is going to be a prefix we add to every single one of the keys we save inside of our local storage. And the reason for that is that local storage is site dependent. So when you're working inside a local host, all of your sites that you're working on localhost share the same local storage. And that can lead to weird bugs where if you have a local storage item named the same in two different applications, they're going to be conflicting when you go between these two different applications because you got data from the old application overwriting data in the new application. And it's really only a problem when you're inside of development because that's where you're running all your sites on the same local host. So what I like to do is just have this local storage prefix that I put in front of all of my keys. That way, even if I name two things the exact same thing between two different applications, they never actually conflict with one another. Next, let's create a key for our to-dos. So we'll say to-dos storage key. We're just going to set that equal to string interpolation, where we're going to get our prefix. So local storage prefix, and we're going to add into the end of here. Just get rid of this hyphen here, put the hyphen down here, and we're just going to say to-dos. There we go. So this is our storage key. We can just copy this, paste it into our set item here. Then we need to store our to-dos. And like I said, this must be a string. We can't just put our array of to-dos in here. This is going to throw an error. If I run this, click add to-do, come over here and inspect, you're going to see that if we go over to our application, we go to our local storage, you're going to see our advanced to-do list is not actually an array. It's just one single item. And when we add another item into here, click add, you can see it's just an item with a comma and another item. It's not actually storing this as an array like we would expect. So what you want to do instead is to convert this from a JSON array into a string. And JSON.stringify is perfect for this. So now we're converting this array into a string, which means it'll be stored with array syntax inside of our storage. So now let's save this, add a to-do, add another to-do. And if we go over to this application tab, look at our local storage, you can see this advanced to-do list dash to-dos is now stored as an array. You can even see down here, we can access it as an array. So even though it's stored as a string, this value is a string, it is stored in the syntax of an array. So when we now load this, we can load it into an array instead of loading it just as a normal string. And I'll show you how to do that in just a little bit. Because as you notice, when we refresh our page, even though we're saving our data, we're not actually loading it. So in order to load our to-dos, let's do that next. We can clear out this comment. And next, we're going to be working on loading our to-dos. So let's just come in here and create a function called load to-dos. And this function is going to be pretty straightforward. We want to get our to-dos, which are going to come out as a string, like I mentioned. Local storage is always a string, so it's going to come to us as a string, and we're going to get that from our local storage. So we'll say get item of to-dos storage key. Now this is going to be our to-dos in string format. Or if we don't have any to-dos, for example, it's our first time loading the application, it's going to return to us undefined. What we want to do here is convert this. So we can say json.parse. This is going to take a string and convert it to a JavaScript object or array, in our case, an array. We'll pass in here to-dos string. So now what's going to happen is we're going to convert this string into an array. And if we just set our to-dos up here to the function call of load to-dos, you can now see that when we save and refresh, nothing is actually happening. And the reason for that, again, is that we now have these to-dos in this variable. I can actually console.log these to-dos, and you'll see when I inspect our page, go to our console, it actually has an array which contains both of our objects. So this array is correct. It's filled with our objects, but they're not being displayed. That's because we're never rendering these to-dos. So all I need to do is say to-dos.for each one of our to-dos. I just want to call render to-do and pass in the to-do. And we can even simplify this by just saying render to-do, because it'll automatically pass the to-do in for us. Now if I save, you'll notice our to-dos are being rendered. And if we add another one, click save, refresh, it'll automatically save these for us. What happens if the user comes to our page for the very first time, which means that they don't have this information inside of their local storage? Let's delete this from our local storage by just clicking the delete key and refresh our application and see what happens. You'll notice in our console, we immediately get an error. Cannot read property for each of null. And the reason for that is that we're trying to convert here nothing. This is nothing. This is undefined. We're trying to convert that to an object, so it converts it to the closest thing it can, which is null. So what we can do in here is use short circuiting and just put in the or here and an empty array. What this does is says, return this if it returns to me some truthy value, for example, an array of objects, or if this is undefined or null or false, then return to us an empty array. Now when I save my application and go over to our console, we no longer have any errors. And that's because even though there's no data stored inside of our local storage, it's just defaulting to an empty array for us. So we're using that nice short circuiting trick here. And that's all it takes to load our to-dos. To make sure this works, let's add a to-do, and you can see everything's working as we expect. And before we go too much further, I just want you to kind of realize how powerful this system is. We listed out all the different things that we can do, and then one by one, we're just logically tackling them as we get to them. The first thing we did is add to-dos, and then we realized they're not being saved, so we saved to-dos. Then we realized, even though we're saving them, we're not loading them, so the next thing we need to do is load the to-dos. So we're able to just slowly, one by one, tackle all these different features, all by starting with whichever one was the easiest and quickest to implement for us without relying on anything else. And that's the powerful way of thinking about this, because you just list out all of these different things, for example, like we did at the beginning, and choose the one that's the easiest and quickest to get started with. Then from there, all the other pieces just fall into place. Now we do, of course, still have problems with our code. If we check one of these to-dos to mark it as complete and refresh, that's not actually being saved inside of our system. So what we need to do is also save on top of the name, we need to save the status to see if it's checked or not. And that is a little bit trickier to do. This means that we can no longer just store the name inside of our array, because we need to be able to reference a name and a complete or not complete Boolean. So we need to reference two different pieces of information together, and the best way to do that is going to be using an object. So here, instead of just using the to-do name, we need to create a brand new to-do. We're just going to call it new to-do, and this is going to be an object. The object is going to have a name property, which we can set to our to-do name just up here. So this is essentially what we currently have, but now it's an object form. And the next thing we need to store is whether or not this to-do is complete. And if we're creating a brand new to-do, obviously it's not complete yet. So we're going to set our complete flag here to false. Now, when we render a to-do, we need to pass in the entire new to-do, just like this. And we also need to save the entire new to-do to our array. So we're going to pass that in here. So now what we're doing is we made some code, and now we realize that due to certain features we want, we need to change our code. This is called refactoring. So when you're refactoring, it's really important to kind of make sure you understand the code that you are reading in order to make the changes you need. Luckily, we just wrote this code, so it's pretty easy to know what everything does because we just wrote it a few minutes ago. But if this code is older, it may take you some time to read the code and really understand what's going on. But that's really important to do before you start making a bunch of changes, because you want to make sure you don't break anything accidentally. So now we've pushed in the new to-do to our array, and we passed it into render to-do. So our render to-do is now taking a to-do and not just an individual name, which means down here, we need to take our to-do and get the name property from it to set for our inner text instead of just setting the name directly. That should be all we need to do for this saving function though, for adding a new to-do. So let's see if this works, because this render to-do is just taking the to-dos from our array and passing them in here, which is exactly what we would expect. So we're going to save this, and of course we already have a problem. These are saying undefined. The reason for that is if we inspect our page, go over to our application over here, we already have data stored in the wrong format inside of our array. We need to get rid of that information. So generally when you make changes that deal with local storage, it's a great idea to come in here and just clear out your local storage. Then you can actually start from a clean slate to make sure you don't have any other data that's corrupting what you're working on. Now let's add a to-do. You can see that works as before. Add another to-do, and when we refresh, it still works. So we haven't broken anything, but now we have the ability to track whether or not something is complete or not. This obviously doesn't work with anything because we haven't actually hooked this complete up, but we now have the ability to track it, which is super important. So when you're going about refactoring your code and you realize you need to make changes, it's generally easiest to make the changes you need and then start writing the new code on top of it after you realize all of the old code still works as before. So now we can move on to handling this complete. We need to figure out when we check this checkbox. That's luckily pretty straightforward to do. Since we don't know how many to-dos there are, and we can always be adding new to-dos, we can't just get the to-dos on page load. We can't say something here like const to-do check boxes equals document.query selector all. This is not something that we can do because we're constantly adding new ones. Instead, what we want to do is just set up an event listener on our document. And actually, instead of setting it up on the document, I'm going to set it up on our list object, since we know all of our to-do checkboxes are inside of this UL list right here. So we can just say list.add event listener, and we want to listen to the event listener of change. This is going to occur whenever we change our input from one value to another value. And we're going to run this function here. And inside here, we just want to check to see if this is a checkbox. So we can say if e.target.matches, we need to figure out what we're trying to match. So let's go over here and look at what we're trying to match. As you can see here, we have an input type checkbox, and it has this data attribute, data list item checkbox. We can just copy that into our matches here, put it inside the brackets so we know to match a data attribute, and this is going to check to see if we're matching one of these checkboxes. Another way to do this, if you don't want to look at the HTML, is just inspect your page, go to the Elements tab, and just see when you click on this little icon in the top left here. Let me just shrink this down a little bit. This icon up in the top left lets you select an element on your page. You click on this, click on your checkbox, it'll bring you exactly to where that element is, so you can see which selector you need to use. In our case, data list item checkbox is the selector that we're going to use. So we can just use that inside of this e.target matches. And in order to make this a little easier, instead of doing this where we write our code inside of here for when it matches, I want to actually check for when it doesn't match. And if it doesn't match, I just want to return. Essentially, all this does is let us short circuit out early, and that way we don't have code nested inside of an if. It just looks a little bit cleaner. Now here, we can put all of the code for what to do when we click on our checkbox. So let's think about what this code is going to look like and write it out in pseudocode first instead of going through and actually writing the code, because it's hard to write code unless you know what the code is supposed to do. So what are we going to do inside of here? Well, the first thing we need to think about is now that we've checked a to-do, we need to get the to-do that is checked. Okay, that makes sense. Whichever one we clicked on. So we'll just say clicked on. And then what we need to do is with that to-do, we need to toggle the complete property to be equal to the checkbox value. So if the checkbox is checked, we set complete to true. If the checkbox is not checked, we set complete to false. Then finally, we need to save our updated to-do. Okay, so first step first, what we need to do is get the to-do that's clicked on. So how do we go about doing that? Well, there's a couple ways that immediately I can think of. The first would be to get the text of the to-do, and then go into our to-dos array and find the to-do that matches that text. What happens if we have two to-dos that have the exact same name? Obviously, this is no longer going to work because if we check this to-do, we want to be able to reference this exact to-do and not the one up here. There's no way to distinguish them. So instead, we need to create a unique identifier for each one of our to-dos. So how do we go about creating a unique identifier for each one of our to-dos? Well, we're going to need to do it on the time that we create our to-do. And you might just be thinking, okay, we're just going to come in here, say our ID is equal to something like math.random. While technically this will probably work as long as you don't create too many to-dos, there's always a chance that this returns to you the exact same number twice. There's no guarantee that it's always going to be a different number. It just guarantees you it's a random number. It could return the same random number twice. You don't really know. So a better alternative is to try to think of something that is going to be random enough for us and that's going to be unique. And in our case, what we can do is we can create a new date. And all we need to do once we create a new date is get the value of it, because this is going to give us the current time down to the millisecond. And if we call the value of function, this is going to give us the number of milliseconds since a certain date in the past, which means as long as we create less than one date per millisecond, then we're going to be unique because this is a different value every millisecond that passes. Then we just need to convert this to a string and we're completely done. And the reason we're converting this to a string is because inside of local storage, everything gets converted to a string. So for comparison's sake, we want this to be a string to get started with. So there we go. That is everything that we need to do to get started with our new to-do. We have a date, we got the millisecond, which gives us an ID. We converted it to a string for easy comparison. And this is going to be unique as long as we create only one to-do per millisecond. And it's pretty much impossible for someone to create more than one to-do in a millisecond. So this is going to be good enough for our use case. And now we have an ID for our to-do. But how do we reference that ID? Because right now here, all we have is essentially a reference to our checkbox. We don't have a reference to a to-do. So we need to be able to get the ID of the individual to-do that we're checking. And the easiest way to do that is actually to save the to-do inside of our application here. So what I want to do is for each one of our LIs here, I just want to have an attribute that just says to data to-do ID is equal to whatever our ID is. I want to add this data attribute to our list item for each one of our list items that we create so we know exactly what the ID is. Then when I click on this checkbox, I can reference this parent element here and get the data to-do ID, and from there get the individual to-do. This may sound a little bit confusing, but let me kind of show you how this works. Inside of this script.js here, I want to take this ID and save it somewhere on our to-do so that we can reference it from an HTML element. The only way to do that is to save it in our HTML. So now instead of just rendering out the text for our to-do, we also need to render out that ID. So we can say const list item is equal to template clone dot query selector, and this is dot list item because it has the class list item, as we can see over here. This is going to get us this LI. Then what we want to do is take our list item dot dataset dot to-do ID and set it equal to our to-do dot ID. So now we have the ID of each one of our to-dos being saved. And if we just save this, and since I messed with data that's being stored in local storage, I just want to clear our local storage, as you can see. So here we go, clear that. And now refresh our page. That's going to be empty. Add a to-do, add a to-do. And you'll notice if I click this, you can see that they have a randomly generated ID that's going to be unique for both of them. And best of all, if I inspect one of these elements, you can see our data to-do ID is being populated with the ID of each one of our to-dos. So now we have the ID of our to-do inside of the HTML, which we can link to from our checkbox, which means we can get the ID from the checkbox and then get the to-do. So we can link our checkbox to an individual to-do. So let's work on that next. And again, you notice that as soon as I ran into a problem up here, I stopped working on this code, started working on the old code. As soon as I finished what I needed, I then checked to make sure the old code still worked, and then I'm moving on to the new code. I always want to make sure what I had previously worked, because that way I know if I start changing code up here, that if something breaks, then the changes are related to right here. So it's easier for me to debug and fix those errors. So now we need to get the to-do that is clicked on. And to do that, we need to, of course, get the ID of the to-do. So we can say our parent, which is our list item, is going to be equal to e.target.closest, and we want to get the closest list item. Then we can get the to-do ID, which is just parent.to-do ID. We just saved that information, and now we're getting that information. And now we can just get the individual to-do we want. So we can say const to-do is equal to to-dos.filter. .find. This is going to give us one to-do. We want to get the to-do that matches here. So we're just going to call this t. So we'll say t.id is equal to to-do ID. So when the ID of our to-do is equal to the to-do ID that's in our HTML, we know that we have the current to-do for this checkbox. And here we can just set our to-do.complete equal to e.target.checked. This is going to be true if it's checked and false if it's not. Now, once we do that, we've essentially accomplished this step, and the last thing to do is save our updated to-do, so we can just call save to-dos. And the reason that this works is because we're just modifying this object, and this object is referenced inside of our to-dos array, so we're just changing it inside of the array right here, and then we're just saving it. So let's get rid of these comments for things that we've already done, save this, and see if it works. What we're going to do is check this, and then we're going to inspect our application data to see if that actually checked. So as you can see here, our complete is now set to true. We uncheck it, and our complete is now set to false. But if we refresh our page, of course, nothing is working as expected. So why exactly is that? Inside of here, it still has complete set to true, so why is it not being shown on our page? Well, you need to think about what's happening. How are these to-dos being listed on our page? They're coming from our render to-do function. So let's go there, and you'll realize we're not using that complete flag at all. We're never setting our to-do box to checked or unchecked, depending on if it's complete or not. So we need to get our to-do checkbox. So here we'll just say checkbox is equal to template clone.query selector. And let's see what the selector is again. It is just data list item checkbox. Copy that over. There we go. So now we have a reference to our checkbox. And we can say our checked property is going to be equal to our to-do.complete. So if it's complete, it'll be checked. If not, it won't be checked. And now you can see immediately when we refresh our page, this is checked. We uncheck it, refresh, it persists all of the data. So it's properly persisting our checked status as well as the list of all of our to-dos. This means if we scroll down here, we've completed this section about completing to-dos, and the last thing we have left to do is for deleting our to-dos. So in order to delete our to-dos, we need to reference when this delete button is clicked, which is going to look very similar to this code here. We can say list.addEventListener. This time it's going to be on click. And here what we want to do is we want to check to see if e.target.matches. And if we come over to our index here, you can see we have data button delete for our delete button. So we want to match this data attribute. And if this is not true, then we want to return. I just put this exclamation to say if it's not true, we want to return. But if it is true, then that means we clicked on this delete button. So of course, we need to get the actual element we're clicking on, get the to-do that is referenced by this delete button. And it's going to work very similar to what we did up here. From this button, we can get the parent, which is this list item, and determine what we actually clicked. So we can say const parent is equal to e.target.closest.list item. And then we can get the to-do ID, which is equal to parent.dataset.to-do ID. So now that we have that, we're able to reference our particular to-dos. But really what we need to do is two steps. We need to first remove the to-do from the screen, remove the to-do from the list, save the new to-dos. So we want to remove it from up here. When we click delete, we want it to be removed from our screen. We also want to remove it from this to-dos list here, and then resave our to-dos to not have that deleted to-do inside of it. So let's first remove the to-do from the screen. That's really easy. We can just say parent.remove. It's going to remove the entire list item. Now if I click delete, it's going to remove these items. But we're not saving, so clearly when I refresh the page, they show back up. So we've removed the to-do from the screen. Done. Next thing is remove the to-do from the list. So we need to re-update our list. So to do that, we can just say to-do.filter. This is going to give us a new list that contains values that return true to this function. And this is to-dos here, not to-do. And for each one of our to-dos, we just want to see if the to-do.id is equal to to-do ID. And if this is not true, then that means that we want to save it. And if it is true, we want to remove it. So essentially we're saving whenever these two are not equal to each other, we want to keep this to-do, but when they are equal, we want to remove it. And we just set our current to-dos array equal to that. Then we can just call save to-dos, and this is going to work, but we're going to get an error. We delete these, refresh, you'll notice it still doesn't work. So the best thing to do is to check our console. We go to our console after deleting something, you'll notice uncaught type error assignment to constant variable. On line 26, where we're resetting our to-dos. That's because we defined to-dos as a const. We need to just reset this to a let, and that'll allow us to redefine our to-dos down here. Now when we delete something and refresh, it permanently deletes that from our list because it's removing it right here and then saving those to-dos. And that right there is the entire thought process that I would go through to create this to-do list application. In the next video, I'm going to let you take these skills that you just learned and apply them on your own project, and I'm not going to give you any direction at all. So that way you can really test your skills of thinking like a programmer, breaking things down, and building it out perfectly. So I can't wait to see you in that next video.